Good evening and welcome. My name is Peter Fröberg. I am an author and a literary critic, and I have the great privilege to host this conversation tonight. I think it will be most interesting. So let me introduce to you the Mexican writer Fernanda Melchor, born in 1982 in the southeastern state of Veracruz, which is also the setting for her second novel, Temporada de Huracanes, Hurricane Season. This novel has become an international bestseller. It has received several national and international awards and was last year shortlisted for the International Booker Prize. So, welcome, Fernanda.
Thank you very much, Peter. It is so nice to be here.
Yeah. There is also a Swedish edition now, Orkansäsong, published by the excellent publishing house Tranan, and translated by Hanna Nordenhök. Hanna is also an author who started out as a poet but now has several acclaimed novels to her name. Welcome, Hanna.
Thank you.
At this point, I should probably present the novel Hurricane Season in some detail. But I know the audience is not here to hear me babbling. So I would like to ask Fernanda, could you please introduce this excellent novel to us?
Of course. So I think it is always best if someone else talks about the book one has written, because it is always very difficult, but I try to be very succinct. And Hurricane Season is it's a novel that takes place in a really small town called La Matosa, surrounded by cane fields in the southeast of Mexico. It is a sort of forgotten place because it seems like the state and authorities have abandoned the population of this small town, and they live in practically in misery. So in this small town, a group of children found the corpse of a person, of a woman who is the witch of the village. And women of all sorts, especially the prostitutes that live alongside the main road of this small town, they go to her to get healing, to have abortions, for example. And she gets murdered, and the novel tells the tale of why this has happened. The novel explores the hidden truth behind such a horrible crime against a woman that's powerful in her community, and it does so by taking the side of one character at each chapter. So we have sort of a narration that it's like a spiral that goes deep and deep and deep, and in these dark corners of the human soul, of the deep motives for the reasons for such a horrible crime.
According to me, a lot of these conversations about the novel lack something, and that is the novel in itself. I would therefore like to ask you, Fernanda, if you could just read a short section of the novel so we can get like a flavor of the story and the language, please.
Of course. I'm going to start reading by almost the very beginning. It's the beginning of chapter 2. Le decían la bruja, igual que a su madre. La bruja chica cuando la vieja empezó el negocio de las curaciones y los maleficios, y la bruja secas cuando se quedó sola, allá por el año del deslave. Si acaso tuvo otro nombre, inscrito en un papel ajado por el paso del tiempo y los gusanos, oculto tal vez en uno de esos armarios que la vieja atiborraba de bolsas y trapos mugrientos, y mechones de cabello arrancado, y huesos, y restos de comida. Si alguna vez llegó a tener un nombre de pila y apellidos, como el resto de la gente del pueblo, fue algo que nadie supo nunca. Ni siquiera las mujeres que visitaban la casa los viernes oyeron nunca que la llamara de otra manera. Era siempre tú, sonsa, o tú, cabrona, o tú, pinche hija del diablo, cuando quería que la chica fuera a su lado, o que se callara, o simplemente para que se estuviera quieta debajo de la mesa y la dejara escuchar las quejas de las mujeres, los gimoteos con los que salpimentaban sus cuitas, achaques y desvelos, los sueños de parientes muertos, las broncas con aquellos aún vivos y el dinero, casi siempre era el dinero, pero también el marido, y las putas esas de la carretera. Y yo no sé por qué me abandonan, justo cuando más ilusionada me siento, le lloraban, y todo para qué gemían. Mejor era morirse ya, de una vez, que nadie nunca sepa que existieron. Y con esquina del rebozo se limpiaban la cara, que de todos modos se cubrían al salir de la cocina de la bruja, porque no fuera a ser que luego dijeran, una nunca sabía, con lo chismosa que era la gente del pueblo, de que una iba con la bruja porque se tramaba una venganza contra alguien, un maleficio contra la cusca, que andaba sonsacando al marido, porque no faltaba la que inventaba falsos, cuando una inocentemente lo que nada más andaba buscando era un remedio para el empacho de este pinche chamaco atascado que se zampó solito, 1 kilo de papas, o un té que sirviera para espantarse el cansancio, o una pomada para los desarreglos del vientre, pues, o nomás sentarse ahí un rato en la cocina, a desahogar el pecho, liberar la pena, el dolor que aleteaba sin esperanza en sus gañotes.
De kallade henne häxan, samma som hennes mamma, lillhäxan när den gamla började göra affärer på sina läkekonster och förbannelser, och bara häxan när hon blev ensam det där jordbävningsåret. Om hon händelsevis hade haft ett annat namn uppskrivet på en maskäten papperslapp naggad av tidens tand, gömd i något av skåpen som den gamla proppade fulla med påsar och lortiga trasor och avryckta hårtussar och matrester. Om hon nu en gång i tiden hade fått sig ett dopnamn och ett efternamn som alla andra i byn, då var det ett namn ingen någonsin fick veta. Inte ens kvinnorna som kom på besök om fredagarna hörde henne tilltalas på något annat sätt. Det var alltid du, trögskalle, eller du, ditt as, eller du, förbannade yngel av Satan, när hon ville att lillungen skulle komma, eller att hon skulle hålla tyst, eller bara sitta still under bordet och låta henne lyssna i fred på kvinnornas klagovisor, på gnället de förstärkte sina sorger, krämpor och bekymmer med. Eller deras onda drömmar om döda släktingar och gräl med de ännu levande. Och pengaproblemen. Det handlade nästan alltid om pengar och om deras män och slamporna där borta på motorvägen. Och varför skulle just jag bli övergiven precis nu när jag hade fått lite hopp, grät de ut hos henne. Och vad ska alltihop vara bra för, beklagar de sig. Och man kan lika gärna dö med en gång. Och bättre om man aldrig funnits. Och de torkade sig med falfollen i ansiktena som de ändå skylde varje gång de lämnade huset genom häxans kök. För den händelse att någon skulle säga något. Man kunde ju aldrig veta, så skvallriga som folk var i byn. Och det nöjet ville man ju inte ge någon att få springa runt och påstå att man varit inne hos häxan för att få en att koka ihop en eller annan hämnd på den eller den. Eller skicka någon förbannelse över någon slyna som gått och bjudit ut sig till ens man. Det fanns gott om sådana som hittade på falska rykten, fast det enda man gjort, helt oskyldigt, hade varit att komma och be om botemedel för den där förstoppningen snorungen där hemma hade dragit på sig efter att ensamma glufsat i sig ett helt kilo potatis, eller något te som kunde jaga bort tröttheten, eller en kräm mot underlivsbesvären alltså, eller helt enkelt bara för att sätta sig en stund där inne och sen i köket och lätta sitt hjärta, låta det onda komma ut, plågan som tröstlöst fladdrade i bröstet.
Thank you. Fernanda, you started out as a journalist, and as I understand it, your first intention was to write this book as a non-fiction story in the style of Truman Capote. Last year, I think Mexico was ranked as the most dangerous country in the world for journalists. Can you please tell us some more about your decision to abandon the initial idea and tell the story as fiction instead?
Yes, of course. I think many writers like myself, we are inspired by things that we read in the news, that we found in newspapers. And this was not the exception, of course. I once bumped into this newspaper story about a witch from a small town being murdered. And the murderers accused her of doing witchcraft on them. And it was sort of a self-defense crime. And it was at the same time horrible. And at the same time, I just couldn't believe that in 21st century, we're talking about still witchcraft and women getting killed because of practicing some sort of, I don't know, like religious or healing practices. And it seemed, for me, this was something that was very Veracruzian-like, very from the region I am, where we have this beautiful and very strange and peculiar mix of Catholic beliefs and also African beliefs and the religions that went to America through slavery. And also we had this the persistence of indigenous practices that survived the Spaniard conquer. And it is all mixed in a way that people from Veracruz have really strong spiritual beliefs. They believe in spirits, they believe in exorcisms. And it was all around myself growing up. And I'm a skeptic person myself, sorry. I'm an atheist, so I don't really believe in, I don't have really these spiritual beliefs, but I found them fascinating. And I was fascinated for this story. And then I thought that maybe I could go there to this small town near my hometown. I was living in Puebla at that time, 2015, I think. And I have been living in Puebla for a while. And it was just so dangerous to go there. My first intention was to go to this small town and, go to the crime scene and interview all the witnesses and go even to the prison of that place and try to talk to the murderers, like Truman Capote does in Cold Blood. But then I thought that I wasn't Truman Capote myself. And of course, Veracruz, it is not the United States of the 60s, of the decade of the 60s. And it was very dangerous to go there, not so much as a journalist, but also as a woman. And I didn't have any financial resources because I haven't been practiced. I was a housewife back then, and I didn't have any credentials. I hadn't worked for a newspaper in a long time. And even though I was very interested to do so, to reflect in some way the reality of that crime and to find the deepest, crudest motives for such a horrible act to happen, I thought that even if I was able to go there, I couldn't expect the murderers, for example, to tell me the truth. Why they will tell me the truth? Me, why, right? So maybe to console myself, I thought that maybe I could write a work of fiction, that I can explore all these dark corners with the help of my own feelings and empathy, and especially the sensibility that I have developed being a journalist for many years in Veracruz area, and also to acknowledge the problems, the huge variety of social problems that Veracruz has been living since I was a child. So it is my experience of Veracruz there, but it's also, it is very important. Yes, for me, it was very important to talk about what was happening in Mexico at that time, the rising of femicide, the impunity that we all lived, that it was impossible to get justice, that a woman could get killed and nothing would happen. No justice was going to be made. And that was the Mexico I was trying to portray in this novel. And it was I had to admit that it was also a bad emotional time for me. I was in the middle of breaking up with my partner for many years. So I was in a bad emotional place when I wrote Hurricane Season. I think I was kind of exorcising all these strong, difficult emotions about motherhood too, for example, about the fear what I felt while living in Mexico, being a woman and being surrounded of all this violence, and at the same time being a woman and reproducing in some sort of way this violence myself.
I wonder, is it in any way dangerous for you as a fiction writer to write a book like this? Or do the criminals, they don't read this kind of
Yes.
novel?
No, I think as a fiction, it is not so much dangerous than to being a journalist. As a fiction writer, you see what happened in Mexico. We don't have a very strong literary audience. it's still a matter of an elite a little bit in Mexico, and popular readings had to do more like self-help books, like or I don't know, like the biographies of football players or TV stars, and literature is still a matter of a few, and this has to do a lot with economic reasons. Prices of books are high in Mexico, and we don't have developed still. It did at the beginning of the 20th century, but now we don't really have a strong network of libraries of to people to go to and develop these reading skills and the love of books. So it's sort of, you can normally you will write a book, and even if it's a success, nothing will happen, because it is not like a huge part of Mexican culture. And still, I think there are great writers now in Mexico writing about lots of important matters, nonfiction and fiction alike. And I will say that it is very difficult to get in trouble as a fiction writer. So that's why I choose also to write about it. The last nonfiction writing I did was a book of personal essays about violence too, called Aquí no es Miami, This is Not Miami. And it's a little bit of a joke, because some people in Veracruz think that we must be like Miami, like we're a coastal city, and it's beginning to get gentrified, some sort of areas in Veracruz. And it is a little bit of, for me to play with the idea that Veracruz will never be Miami, that Veracruz is only Veracruz. It is Veracruz, and it has these ambiguities and dark sides and luminous sides too. And I wanted to reflect the reality of living in Veracruz while the height of the anti-drug wars in Mexico. I'm talking about 2008, 2011. This is when I wrote these personal essays, trying to think and comprehend what was happening, because the presence of this war changed totally the physiognomy and the spirit of a city like Veracruz. So I was trying to cope with that while trying to understand it through writing. And when I wrote nonfiction, I was more close to danger than writing fiction, because I had to talk to people that sometimes wouldn't be really happy to have their stories written, even though I tried to change names and protect witnesses. It was always this threatening feeling that I had over me until I moved away from Veracruz and came here to Puebla to do a master's degree. That was like the pretext I found, but mostly I couldn't stand living in Veracruz anymore because of the violence.
Yeah, the theme of this festival is violence and dignity.
Of course.
And your novel is soaked in violence. The characters have no future, no hope. They live in poverty day to day, in a haze of drugs, alcohol, abusive sex, random violence, and death. Misogyny and homophobia are rampant. What was it like to spend so much time in such a dark and depressive universe?
Well, I think I was already in a dark and depressing universe when I wrote this book, and it was sort of a necessity. I had to write that book, and I had to tell that story. And I've always been, since my youngest years, I've always been interested in this dark side of human nature. I always wonder how a person can pass from a fantasy to the act of committing an actual murder. And I have a theory that everyone, we all can be victims, but we always can be aggressors too. It is in our nature. And I wanted to know what happens when the social circumstances make it possible to commit this sort of crimes because of not able to find justice, because the judicial system is broken, because family and social tissue is dismembered because, as you said, you are too young and you feel no hope towards the future. And I sometimes felt like that when I was growing up in Mexico. And even though I was privileged to have an education and I was privileged to live in a family, well, a sort of dysfunctional family, but not like the families in hurricane season, of course, not like that. And I've always been intrigued by how violence works and how we are at the same time victims and aggressors always, and how that interplays. And most of all, I think it was growing up being a woman in a very chauvinistic family and society. And I don't know, I can tell you that I felt, I myself felt harassed when I was 11 years old, going out in the streets and being sexually accosted, you know, like being subject at catcalling when I was a child. And for me, it was always a mystery. I was fascinated at the same time as repulsed by men in the sense that I couldn't understand what happens in the mind of a man that catcalls at 11 years old, you know, because maybe I was developed as a woman, but I was a child. I mean, I don't know. I've always been fascinated by this subject. And I think growing up in a place like this made me wanted to understand aggressors and also understand how we women also exploit ourselves, women, and how we passed on generation over generation this sort of culture. And I wanted to do it in the crudest way. I mean, I'm talking, as you can see, maybe it is not so present in this part of the book at the beginning, but it gets deeper and deeper into the language of misogyny and into the language of homophobia. And I wanted to do something radical. I just couldn't express this by assuming a third person narrator and narrating all this from above, from a safe distance. I had to be inside the characters and think what they thought with the same words that they will construct this culture and this environment, this scenery. And it was radical because, as you can see, it is very crude and very harsh. And it's sometimes, I wanted the reader to confront themselves with all these discourses that we are surrounded by all the time growing up. And maybe it is not the case in Sweden, I think, but in Mexico, it is very common still to think that women, we are second-class citizens. And it is natural, the violent things that happen to us.
When you're talking about the characters, I find it very easy to sympathize with the characters, but they are hard to like. I mean, they're formed by a violent and loveless society. And I was wondering, how did you come up with these characters in the first place? I mean, where did you find Yesenia, Brando, Doña Tina, and where did it come from?
I don't know. There's a Mexican writer that I love. It's Sergio Pitol, and Sergio Pitol used to say that writers, we are people who are filled with voices. And we wake up with these voices and we are very much alike, like crazy people, because all these voices always surrounding us. And I think it is very difficult to say where a character comes from. I think it was Bakhtin who said that that characters are this sort of shadows that come from the night of our lives. And I think it's very beautiful the way he puts it. And it is true. I don't know where they came from. I only knew from the newspaper story that I read that there was a witch and then there were 3 killers and that's it. So I had to give them families and partners and I don't know. I have to place them in a scenery, and I created La Matosa. And it was a very intuitive process where I will try to understand this story, try to understand why these people killed the witch, who was the witch, And immediately I start hearing these voices of women, the women of La Matosa, talking in hushes, you know, and contradicting each other and gossiping about, yes, the way she was this person and she was awful. And the other one, no, she was good. She helped and Tia Stella and Luis Miji was such a, you know, like they were always talking. And I thought that the novel had to have this quality. I wanted to honor this sort of verbal communication that we call gossip, and that we normally wouldn't think that it's literary, that it's art, but I think it is. I think it is such a beautiful way of narrative that is very emotional, that is very intense, and I wanted that. I wanted hurricane season to be intense. I wanted to be, you know, that this has this quality that when you are listening to a really good and juicy gossip and you are very interested and you want the things continuing. I remember when I was a child in Veracruz and my mother and my aunts and my grandmother and the neighbors all gathered together to tell gossips, you know, to hang around. And I remember that they wouldn't talk in front of me because they wanted to tell the gossip about the neighbor who ran away with another man and all sorts of, you know, and then I will pretend I was sleeping. So they thought I was sleeping and they will talk freely. And I love those kinds of stories that they told all the time. And this is a sort of way of honoring this sort of communication. Very, very beautiful. In Veracruz, I think people have this talent for telling oral stories. They have a real good talent of using words to tell a story. And we have great narrators who I don't think they even finished grade school, for example, but they have this beautiful art of speaking and making a compelling story for their audience. And I wanted to honor that a little bit. Mm.
Right. The only person who has an equally intimate relation to a novel as the author is the translator. Hanna, what was it like to enter this dark world of despair, and how did you find a way to translate the music of the language?
Well, I mean, I immediately felt that I was in a strong contact with Fernanda's language and also the way she composes the voices. I think she has a very, I mean, the book has a very intricate composition. And it constructs itself in layers of voices and sceneries, and also the timeline is extremely intricate. And I just felt directly that I had this strong contact with the text and that I was swept away by it. I mean, with these hurricane movements, no. And so I felt I just tumbled into it. I just you know, I just became very, very hooked up with it. So I felt also that I immediately understood the text. This was my sensation. So I was just so happy because it was the first novel that I translated, and it was a love. You know, it was a yeah.
Because I mean, it's rather special. I mean, the sentences, they go on and on for pages, and the language is sometimes not appropriate for children. So how did you manage to find the right Swedish for this very special Mexican expression?
Well, I mean, in Sweden we don't have this organic relation with the swearings and so on, and a bad language. But I think that for me and for many people, of course, it's also a question about class and class. I mean, what milieu you're moving in, no? But for me, the words that came for me was the words of my childhood and my teenage years, no, which was in the south of Sweden. So there was a lot of skånska, a lot of Skånish that came out for me, like something very, I mean, and this sort of campesino, alltså this sort of farmer language, or this sort of det här bonniga snacket, så att säga. That just, you know, I felt that I had to be true to that. So I felt it had to be also, because the swearings in Mexican Spanish is also very, they are sort of timeless. I mean, it's the same swearings you read in about when Octavio Paz is talking about the verb chingar, for example. I mean, they have existed for a long time, and in Sweden, I think the swearings are much more time related and dated, and you have to really find the right timeless feeling for it. So I worked a lot with the swearings and the bad language, actually, and it was wonderful to just explore Swedish. I mean, to explore my own vocabulary in Swedish with this. Yeah,
I think you did very well.
That is so beautiful. I'm sorry. That is so beautiful, and it is true that it must be different, and we have a relationship that is different totally in Mexico with bad words. Sometimes they could be just, they are not to insult, but to make an emphasis on something.
Exactly.
Or they can be words of endearment. Sometimes bad words, and it is very strange. And I'm super happy. It is beautiful to hear Hanna talk about all this work that she had to do, because I imagine that it is not an easy task. Not only to translate the bad words, but to translate the subtext behind that. I think the intention of making visible this misogyny and this homophobia, and not justifying it, of course. Yes.
And to find the right, I mean, sometimes a Swedish word that is literally translated as swearing from Mexican Spanish, it sounds a lot more crude, and then you have to, or less crude, and then you have to find the equivalent in Swedish to really get the right sound. And,
this is very interesting. And the class subject also, I remember talking up with Bart Pepperkamp, the Dutch translator, and he told me that, for example, of course, Brando and Yesenia, they don't swear the same way. Then in Spanish, they use the same words, but, for example, Brando will use the swearing that young immigrants in Netherlands will use, for example. And I thought it was a very clever, very clever proposal, solution.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, I'm happy that you have started talking now with each other, because before we were in touch before this conversation, and I asked you if you could come up with one question each. For if you have a question for Fernanda and Fernanda has a question for Hanna. Did you do that? Did you do your homework?
No, I forgot.
No, but if we need to talk, we can talk right now. I'm so thrilled. I work very close-knit with Hanna with this translation. Of course, I don't understand a word of Sweden, but of Swedish, but we talked a lot, and we shared meanings and some cultural particularities from Mexico, and now it was just such an honor to learn from her and to understand my book better from having these conversations that we had. And I'm just honored, you know. I never expected, to be honest, I never expected that a Swedish publishing house will be interested in translating Orkansäsong, but I never thought that this book will be translated. I mean, I had an artistic intention of mixing our literary form with very social and urgent and crude situations. And I knew what I was writing, but I never thought that this could interest people outside Mexico, for example. So I'm always amazed and very grateful and very curious to know how a book like this will read in a place like Sweden.
Well, I have some question. I mean, I think about. I mean, this festival is about violence and dignity, and we talked earlier about your characters, and also I've talked to you about that before, because I think there is something very interesting in how you portray them in all their crudeness, but also in their innocence. I mean, and they have, all of them have some sort of light within them, and this is where I think the point of dignity comes in. It's you also show them as the children they once were.
The unloved children.
Yeah.
Because I think we don't normally talk about this when I present Orkansäsong, but I strongly believe that this is a love book. This is a love story. But this is a love story where love is absent. In Spanish, you cannot find the combination of words that the letters of the word love, amor, in Spanish. It doesn't exist. I was very careful not to put it because I wanted to create a word where love is everything that the characters are looking for, but they haven't been able to be loved, so they don't really know what love looks, and they confuse love. For example, Norma confuses the passion of his stepfather with the tenderness she needs from her mother, and she succumbs to his seduction, to his grooming, for example. And Luismi, of course, he searches in drugs what the dignity and the love he should have had from his mother, Chabela. But Chabela could not love a child that was, she was forced to have him. So she could not love him the way he needed. And it's all like a chain, like a chain of a person desperately looking for love. But at the same time, they don't really know what love is like. So they confuse it all the time. And Brando, for example, who feels so attracted to Luismi, almost in love of Luismi, and he hates that feeling and that desire because he was taught to think that loving another man is such a forbidden sin, and he hates that desire inside of himself. And it is true, Hanna, what Brando does is horrible, and he's, I think, a very psychotic, near-psychotic character, but at the same time, you can understand why he is like that, because it must be horrible to live a life where you hate yourself, like he hates the desire he feels for other men, and that must be something that maddens him. You can understand it, and I think it was a very difficult task to provide all these characters. Munra, for example, who's an alcoholic, and he's like, good for nothing a little bit, but he has this, he's a human being. And that is the lesson that I learned from Truman Capote and in Cold Blood, that in Cold Blood you can hear the voices of the killers, the murderers of that family, and still you understand where they come from. You understand the wounds they are carrying from childhood and all the difficult circumstances that they had to go through. But at the same time, you totally understand that the thing that they have done is horrible. So it is trying to find a balance to humanize. And we are not, we are not cartoon characters that are only villains or heroes. We are human beings, and we are all capable of the most sublime acts of heroism, but at the same time, we are capable of the most vile, horrible things also. And I was trying to picture that. And the novel also had to have these light moments, these luminous moments, because you cannot spend so much time in misery all the time. So I know, I think misery wants a little bit, but it is also about the ending. I'm not trying to make any spoiler or anything. I don't think this novel, it's a novel that you can spoil. I think because from the end, you get a clear picture of who killed the witch. But here, the mystery is why and what were the circumstances. I think that's the thing that make it different from a normal crime mystery. The thing that's a mystery is another thing. It is not a whodunit crime book, but it is more trying to understand why these things happen. And I have a question for Hanna, if I am allowed to make it. I'm curious to know if Hanna thinks, do you think if there are things that are untranslatable in your experience as a translator of my novel? And I think you have translated poetry. I think that's harder to translate.
I think in a way everything is untranslatable because of course I can never give the same feeling of an atmosphere of your book than the original, no, but of course I have to. It's an interpretation act to sort of understand towards what I need to be loyal in your texts, and try to give to the Swedish reader what I find is the tone, the atmosphere, the so on, and that means also moving the whole thing to a new context, to a new literary text. No, so it's something else. I mean, it's your book, but it's something else, of course. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. I have a very high respect for translators, and I think what you do is another literary creative writing. It is not just something that you pour from one glass to another. It's a whole different task, and I think it's beautiful. And when we first talked, I think I was trying to give you the freedom to make a work of yourself. As to say it in a way.
All right.
Yeah.
We're actually running out of time. I have a lot of questions left, but some other time maybe. And I would like to ask you if you could do a final reading, so we get back to the novel. We'll finish with the novel as well.
Of course, I will go first. This is from chapter 3, I think.
Yesenia.
Sí. Yes. Aquella era la primera vez que se lo topaba de frente en los caminos del pueblo, porque el muy maricón se escondía de ella y nomás salía por las tardes o por las noches como un chingado vampiro para juntarse con los malvivientes esos que nomás se la vivían drogándose y emborrachándose y robando a los incautos que cruzaban el parque de Villa por la noche y agarrándose a madrazos y a botellazos con los otros rufianes que frecuentaban las cantinas de los portales o rompiendo los focos de las farolas y orinando sobre las paredes y las cortinas de los negocios cerrados que rodeaban el parque. Muchachos sin oficio ni beneficio, huevones todos sin excepción, inútiles y mantenidos, una panda de drogadictos enfermos de la mente. Bueno sería que los metieran a todos a la cárcel, que se los madrearan ahí dentro y los violaran y luego los desaparecieran, para ver si así eran tan machos como cuando manoseaban a las chamaquitas y hasta a los chamaquitos, que cometían la imprudencia de pasar por el parque cuando ellos estaban reunidos. Como si la policía no supiera, carambas, el desmadrito que esos cabrones se tienen con el dueño del Hotel Marbella. ¿De dónde sacan entonces el dinero para comprar la droga que se meten? Si no es ahí mismo en el parque, en lo oscurito, o en los baños de las cantinas y los antros de la carretera, o detrás del almacén abandonado de los ferrocarriles, donde todo el mundo sabe que los putos hacen sus cochinadas, como los perros, a plena luz del día.
Det var första gången hon träffade honom ansikte mot ansikte i krokarna i byn, eftersom den jävla fjollan brukade gömma sig för henne och bara gick ut på kvällarna som en jävla vampyr och hänga runt med dåligt folk som tillbringade tiden ständigt tankade och påtända och vind för våg och rånade varenda pucko som oförsiktigt nog korsade parken i Villa nattetid eller slogs med knutna nävar med de andra dräggen som hängde utanför barerna under arkaderna och krossade flaskor eller krascha gatlyktor och ställde sig och pissade på väggarna och de stängda butikernas neddragna ståljalusier runt om parken. Killar utan vare sig jobb eller talang, dagdrivare allihop utan undantag, misslyckade och vanvårdade, ett gäng sinnesslöa narkomaner. Bäst vore om de kom i finkan allihop så att de fick spö och blev våldtagna där inne och försvann in i skuggorna. Då fick de allt se om de fortfarande var lika kaxiga som när de gick omkring och kladdade på småtjejer eller småkillar för den delen. Sådana som var korkade nog att passera parken när hela gänget var samlat där inne. Som om snuten inte redan visste om den där skiten de asen hade ihop med ägaren till Marbella-hotellet. Herregud, vilket skämt. Hur skulle de annars kunna ha alla de där pengarna de köper sina droger för som de sen smäller i sig där i parken, i halvmörkret, på toaletterna, på skitställena och barerna längs motorvägen eller bakom ödemagasinet vid järnvägen där varenda unge vet att de jävla fikusarna håller på med sin smuts som hundar mitt på blanka dagen. För Yesenia stod det åtminstone klart. Hon hade sett det med egna ögon och det gick inte att räkna på båda händernas fingrar och tårna tillsammans alla de gånger hon hade fått gå och hämta hem skitungen från de där ställena. Och när det aset inte hade dykt upp på flera dagar och Yesenia fick allt svårare att slira på sanningen inför mormor. Och i slutänden kom ändå de där sladdersystrarna Wera och berättade för mormodern om hur snacket gick om ungen i byn. Även om mormor redan varje gång förnekade allt samman så kallade jävla lögner. Och på det viset höll inte hennes barnbarn på. Han var i Gutierrez de la Torre och jobbade på limeplockningen där. Och allt det där om att han bodde inne hos häxan i hennes hus var rena sagorna. Rent förtal som avundsjuka människor utan något bättre för sig än att hitta på falska rykten spred ut. Det var på den tiden Yesenia fortfarande höll tyst och inte hade vågat säga hela sanningen till mormor ännu. Om det där hon senare såg med egna ögon. Det som Wera-systrarna redan berättade för alla som ville höra på. Det där moster Balbi hade förutspått redan från början. Samma dag då mormodern tog hem skitungen. Han kommer bli lika pervers och snedvriden som Maurilio. Eller värre, för om mormor Maurilio sa folk mycket dåligt. Som att han var en fyllegris och en dåre och levde på sina kvinnor. Och att han de sista åren blev så torsk på knark att han menade att det var på den vägen han dragit på sig sjukdomen som sög livet ur honom. Men de sa åtminstone inte om honom att han umgicks med fjollorna i Villa och inte heller att han levde loppan inne hos häxan.
Right, thank you. I have to say, as a literary critic and a writer, I come across a lot of books. And I have to say that the hurricane season really stands out. It's just an extraordinary piece of literature on so many levels. So I would like to say thank you, Fernanda, for writing it. And thank you, Hanna, for translating it. And thank you both for this conversation tonight. It's been great listening to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for your words. You're very kind. And thank you, Hanna. It is always a pleasure to talk to you. And this has been beautiful. Thank you so much.
See you. All right.